Now we have our expenses. We'll move back up to the top line, our revenue, our top line sales figure. What are our earnings? My name's Andrew. I quit my six-figure job as a corporate banker to start a business in a foreign country, and today we'll be going over the performance of my third cycle of 15,000 chickens. We'll be going over the operating performance, the financial results, how much we made, and then we'll discuss a little bit about what's next for the business and the channel going forward. As always, we'll start with a quick background of what the business model is for those of you who are new to the channel here. So I am what's called a contract grower, meaning I am contracted by a larger company known as an integrator to grow chickens on their behalf. We don't own the chickens, we don't process the chickens, we don't sell them downstream. We are simply paid a fee from the integrator to grow them. Now, an important thing to note in this, because I get a lot of comments that say things like, use this kind of feed, add this to your feed, you should grow them for longer. Those are all variables that are out of the control of a contract grower. It is the integrator who provides the inputs. They provide the chicks, the medications, they provide the feed that you use, and they also have a designated target weight that they want the chickens to be at. So in my case, our integrator has a target weight of around 1.3 to 1.5 kilograms, which generally is quite a small size, but that's the target market that they enter with their processed chicken. So we are incentivized to have smaller chickens rather than growing them to 2+ kg. It's just not what they want. And as a result, there's implications for the inputs you get too. Since they don't want really large chickens, the inputs you get generally aren't going to be conducive to growing 2+ kilogram birds in the same amount of time, because that's just not what they're looking for. So both the inputs and the target weight have a heavy influence on the course of the cycle and what the resulting outcome is. So just want to make a quick note of that so you get a better understanding of what is within my control throughout each cycle versus what the integrator controls and how those things align. And then quickly on how we actually get paid. So like I said, we're paid a fee from the integrator, but what does this fee actually depend upon? It depends on a few key performance metrics, including the harvest recovery, how many chickens actually make it to the end of the cycle, the average live weight, what the average weight of them is, and the feed conversion ratio, which is how efficiently the chickens are converting the feed you give them into weight gained. Now, since I said this integrator wants smaller chickens, it is the FCR that really drives our performance fee. The average live weight is built into the feed conversion ratio, which we'll get to at the end here. But yeah, it's really the FCR, which is an efficiency metric rather than trying to grow the birds as large as we can. So that's kind of the name of the game here with this integrator. A lot of other integrators operate their payment schemes heavily influenced by how big you can grow them, but that's not really the case for me here. Now, before diving into the cycle, how the things went, how we're operating, we'll touch on a few key changes that were made before the chicks actually arrived. The first one being new heaters. If you've been here for, since cycle 2, you'll see the heaters we were using were absolutely diabolically bad. They were super old, rusty, they burnt out all the time, they were sketchy to light. Kuya Rodwell going under there, sparking it with a lighter, burning his eyebrows off, not literally, but close to it. No safety mechanisms on them, so they were both highly inefficient and, somewhat of a safety hazard as well. No safety mechanism, this will burn your farm down. And there was no automatic control. So we got new heaters put in by Australia Farm Innovations, really solid company here in the Philippines. And we had automatic temperature sensors that would allow us to set a temperature for each heater. Then they would turn on and off accordingly to keep it within a certain range. So that was a huge help in managing the internal environment. And then one more thing, perhaps even the most important thing, is we had several gas leaks repaired before this cycle. So in previous cycles, we were consuming just an ungodly amount of gas, and it was super expensive, especially for the size of this farm. You have people with farms like 3 times the size, and we're spending more on gas to heat up the inside, which just, even just logically, if you don't know anything about the business, it just doesn't make much sense. So we suspected there was some gas leaks. We had a technician from our gas provider come in, and they did a look around the farm, and they actually didn't find the gas leaks the first time around. So we had to get a second gas company come in and bring a technician and take a look around for us, because I was thinking, there's no way there's not a leak. We're just consuming so much gas. And then they ended up finding 3 gas leaks and repaired that for us. So between those two things, huge saver on one of our largest operating expenses here, which is the gas. And one thing to keep in mind when you're operating in an environment like the Philippines, I'm not saying this was the case here, but it's kind of a frame of mind that people go around with, including myself in business. And you want to see what incentives people have within their business. what drives their revenue. So in this case, again, I'm not saying this happened, but it's just something that I think about is if we have gas leaks, we're consuming more gas than we should. And then in turn, we're ordering more gas from this gas supplier and they're making more money almost as a result of us having gas leaks. So I'm not saying they saw it and didn't tell us, but it's something that I keep in mind and that I always get to verify by maybe multiple people. If you think a deficiency in your business may actually be positively benefiting another business that you're working with, you want to have that verified a few times to make sure there's nothing shady going on. Again, I'm not saying that's happened here, but you need to double check. You just do. Now, with those changes in mind, let's get into the cycle, starting with the initial setup. So we had 15,000 chicks arrive at the farm. They show up in a ventilated truck. There's 188 crates of them. 187 of them have 80 chicks, and then one of them is like half full with 40 chicks, and that adds up to the 15,000. We had 18 dead on arrival. We rejected another 6. We reject them because they show up and they're looking weak, they have physical abnormalities, anything we believe is going to hinder them from making it to the end of the cycle, you get rid of them early, so it's not showing up in your end of the cycle performance. And for the first time, we had 3 people come in and actually physically count all of the chicks, and it's as manual as it sounded. They were literally going through 188 crates, counting all the chicks, and we had 19 missing as well. So that's the first time we ever did that. I've had a lot of people ask, how do you know that's actually 15,000? And it was, you count them. And that's what we did, and we realized we had 19 missing. In the grand scheme of things, that has pretty much a negligible impact on your overall performance. It's such a small number compared to 15,000, it's really not changing your metrics at all, but still something that's good to do. You want to keep the integrator accountable. You don't want to be a business that is open to getting fleeced. You want other people to know you have controls in place, and if there's anything being shorthanded, you're going to catch it. So with all those deductions, the DOA, the rejected, the missing, we started this cycle with 14,957 chicks on day 1. Now, as we head into the cycle here, we'll start by looking at our mortality, starting with week 1. So as with all previous cycles, the biggest issue we've had and our main focus here is maintaining a stable environment, primarily the temperature. Like I've mentioned before, this is an open-sided farm. It's just a thin tarp barrier separating the outside from the inside. So as a consequence, the temperature outside heavily influences the temperature inside. And if you aren't diligent on being proactive in turning your heaters on or off as needed, then your temperature can fluctuate out of control. So that was a huge focus, and the new heaters played a major role in helping us out this time. I think this was the smoothest brooding stage or week 1 that we've had, and it reflected. So we essentially the same performance as previous cycle. We had a really good brooding last cycle, I thought, and this time we only had 5 more mortality, which is worse obviously, but it's almost a negligible difference, so I thought we were kind of on par with last cycle. Now, as we head into week 2, this is where we start seeing the largest discrepancy between this cycle and cycle 2. So as the chicks were growing, we're starting to notice an abundance of weird physical abnormalities in the legs of the chicken. They're like laying on their side, kind of swimming around, not being able to walk. Sideways, another one. There's another one back down there. And this was happening at a pretty high rate, which was starting to get alarming here. Even the integrator dropped off some sort of medication that was supposed to help with their bone development, like unsolicited, and they said that there's been a lot of similar issues at other farms with chicks being derived from this hatchery. So it wasn't just an issue at our farm. It was kind of, unfortunately, the cards we were dealt with this cycle in terms of the chicks that we received. So we did a lot more culling this cycle. Culling being when you are putting chicks out of their misery. You know they're not going to make it, or they're not going to grow very well, and they're just having a tough time day to day, getting the resources that they need, so you get them out of the population. So this time, week 2, we had 402 mortality, 270 of which was from culling, and the previous cycle we barely had any culling. So that was the biggest difference here. Now as we head into the later weeks, week 3, 4, and 5, this was a 30-day cycle, so you have just a couple days in week 5. You see the mortality start to slow down, and that's a common trend you see across all cycles. The birds grow, they get more resilient. The really, really weak ones have probably been a part of previous week's mortality. So you generally see a trend of mortality like this, and then it starts to go down as time through the cycle passes. So that is exactly what we saw, and we saw a pretty meaningful improvement from cycle 2 as well. So we had 93 mortality in week 3, 92 in week 4. Both of those were substantially better than the second cycle. And then you see in week 5, it was a little bit worse, but that was only a couple days in that cycle, so it wasn't huge, it wasn't too big of a deal. The kind of results were set in by that point. Now, totaling this data from across the whole cycle, you can see we had 799 total mortality, which is about 5% of the starting population, 206 worse than the previous cycle. And this is largely driven by the culling. So we actually, in just, your normal day-to-day mortality, was actually better, but then we had this culling and we had all these physical or anatomical abnormalities throughout the chicks that, created some almost forced mortality that significantly drove up this total number. So overall, I actually thought the management wasn't terrible and our mortality in the day-to-day sense wasn't bad, but you got to do what you got to do and take out the chicks that aren't going to make it to the end of the cycle. Another reason why that's important is because if you leave them all in there, they're going to be eating your feed too, and that'll hurt your feed conversion ratio. So you kind of stop them in their tracks, so to speak. So that wraps up the mortality discussion. We'll move on to the average live weight. On average, what was the weight of the chickens week by week here? So we saw a similar trend to last cycle where weight gain was relatively slow, and there really wasn't much of a difference between this cycle and last cycle. You can see we did trail week by week, but by a marginal amount of grams. 10 grams we trailed week 2, 12, and then week 4, only 15 grams. So the pattern was pretty much identical week by week. And again, if you're in farming at all, you go, wow, that is like really, really slow growth. And it is. But I go back to the integrator is not wanting large birds here. So by day 30, they don't want 2 kilogram birds. That's like almost unacceptable to an extent, because that's not what they want at all. They package these into small little, whole processed chickens and then sell them. That's kind of their key product. And the inputs do reflect that. In all honesty, the feed is not great. And you see that's kind of the inputs in many ways. The management, I don't want to discount that. The management is, the most important part in growing the chickens, but the inputs play a huge role as well. And the inputs we receive just really aren't that conducive to growing really large birds. So as a result, you tend to just land within the target range, which happens to be small in this case. So really not much to speak about here. There was nothing crazy that happened. It essentially mimicked last cycle. So we'll now move on to the harvest and how many birds were actually taken at the end of this cycle. So this cycle we did a thinning again on day 28. I didn't get it on camera, unfortunately, because I was in China at the time, but we did a thinning of 2 trucks. For those who don't know, a thinning is when you harvest a minority portion of the chickens that you have that are already at an adequate weight. So you kind of cherry pick the largest birds, get them out of the farm a few days early before the main harvest event occurs. This gives some extra space for the remaining chickens inside the farm, and they have easier access to the resources, and it can help both your feed conversion ratio and your uniformity as well. You're getting the bigger ones out that are already of size, so they're not sticking around eating a lot more feed, and you get big ones out, keep smaller ones, grow them for a few days, and then they get to about the same size is the idea. And then your overall harvest tends to have a better uniformity that way. So you don't need to do this, but it's kind of a tool you have to improve your performance a little more strategically through the management. In this cycle, we did 2 trucks. Last cycle, we did just 1, but we bumped it up this time, and this is what the results look like. Truck 1, 2,550 chickens harvested at an ALW of 1.35 kg. Truck 2, 2,562 chickens harvested at an ALW of 1.38 kilograms. So this gives us a combined thinning harvest of 5,117 chickens at 1.37 kg average live weight. So now with a couple days left in the cycle, the focus kind of shifts where you're trying to get as many chickens as you can up to the minimum threshold weight. In this case with this integrator, it's pretty small. It's only 900 grams is the minimum weight that they accept. So you have a few days at this point. It's day 28. You'll harvest around day 30, 31, and you're making sure that you're tightly monitoring the smallest chickens you have to make sure everything gets up to the minimum weight threshold. Because your harvest recovery, it's not just about your mortality. That plays a huge role, obviously, but it's also about your uniformity. If you have really good mortality, let's say, very, very minimal mortality, you're on track to get a really good harvest recovery, but your uniformity is really bad, you have a huge chunk of chickens that are below the minimum threshold, then those don't get taken. So your harvest recovery, it doesn't differentiate between whether it's mortality or really poor uniformity. It all deducts from the final number of chickens that you had harvested. So we saw that in the first cycle where our mortality wasn't great for sure, but the biggest impact really in overall performance was really bad uniformity, where we had over 400 chickens left behind at the farm. And as a result, our harvest recovery could have been here, just looking at mortality, but then you have 400 birds left at the farm, and then your recovery drops down here just based off of poor uniformity. So that's something to consider when you hear the harvest recovery numbers. It's not all mortality, it's also uniformity as well. Nonetheless, let's look at the remaining 4 trucks and see what the results were. So we have truck 3 here, 2,557 birds harvested at 1.43 kilograms. Truck 4, 2,560 birds harvested at 1.26 kilograms. Not great. Truck 5, 2,569 chickens harvested at 1.34 kilograms. And then the final truck, which in previous videos you'll see too, the last truck generally doesn't get full. It's just cleaning out the remainder of the farm. So you try to stuff as many as you can in there, and then you get a real idea of what your performance is depending on how much you fill up this 6th truck. And in our case, truck number 6, 1,252 chickens at an ALW of 1.01. Not good. So you can see the trend per truck of the ALW kind of go down and down and down, because typically the ones you just have for the very last truck are the ones that were hardest to grab, and those tend to be the smallest ones. Maybe you have a nursery there that you haven't harvested yet and that gets put in the final truck. But so as you can see here, uniformity really not great this cycle. We certainly performed worse in that regard this cycle than we did in cycle 2. So when we total all of these numbers up, we harvested a total of 14,055 chickens, which represents a 94% harvest recovery. And that is 275 chickens less than we harvested the previous cycle. And then we arrived at a cumulative average live weight of 1.32 kilograms, very bottom end of that target range that we're looking to get into, and that was 70 grams lighter than the previous cycle. So both worse harvest recovery and we had a worse average live weight. So you'll see our overall performance wasn't quite as good as it was last cycle. Now, to provide some additional context into these final harvest recovery numbers, we'll take a look at the reject rate. As I spoke about, chickens that get left behind at the farm because they didn't meet the minimum weight threshold. So you can see this cycle, we had 14,158 birds remaining in our inventory when harvest time comes around, and we only harvested 14,055. So that means we had over 100 chickens left behind in the farm because they didn't meet that minimum weight threshold, which was significantly worse than last cycle. So that's another contributing factor to the worst performance. So we had slightly worse mortality, largely due to the culling. And then we also had worse uniformity, resulting in more chicks getting left behind at the farm, and that also played a negative impact on the harvest recovery. So overall, performance 94 it's not egregiously bad by any means, but in comparison to last cycle, which was I think 96% and a better weight, gave us a really good feed conversion ratio. In this cycle, you'll see our FCR deteriorated a little bit as a result of these performance metrics here. So let's get into that now. The feed conversion ratio, this is the key driver here. The key driver of our revenue comes from this one metric: how efficiently the chicks are converting the feed into weight gained. And this is exactly how it's calculated. So you have the number of feed bags you used multiplied by the weight of each bag, which would be 50 kilograms. And then that is divided by your harvest recovery multiplied by your average live weight. So to simplify this, it's the weight of feed over weight of chicken. And that gives you the feed conversion ratio. So if you plug in the inputs that we just went through, we arrive at this. We used 595 bags of feed, which is quite a bit less than last cycle, actually, which helps us out a little bit. We had 14,055 chickens harvested at an ALW of 1.32, and that gives us the FCR of 1.60. So this is actually only 0.02 higher than the previous cycle. So, I'll just take a step back here. The lower the FCR, the better. This means you're using less feed to gain weight in the chicken. And the lower is the better here. A rough figure that we aim for is around 1.5 FCR. That's generally considered to be a good FCR and is a target that we aim for. So we're actually not too far off from previous cycle, largely because the number of bags of feed we used was materially less than last cycle. And that kept our FCR in check. If we used the same amount of bags of feed, say we used 625 bags of feed, that would have yanked up our FCR to look a lot worse than what it actually does here. So overall, obviously a slight deterioration in performance this cycle, but nothing that was too detrimental in terms of the overall performance. So now that we've calculated our FCR, the main revenue driver here, the FCR. So you know, if it went a bit higher, our revenue went a bit lower. That's just the nature of the game. So now that we've gone over the operating performance, how the farm went this cycle, we'll dive into the financials. In FCR, what does it even mean in terms of money in your pocket? That's all anybody really cares about. That's what I care about too. So let's discuss the financials and start building out an income statement for this cycle. So before we get into building it, a quick thing to note here. This is just a simple operating income statement. It's essentially your EBITDA, your earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. To keep it simple, I don't include any depreciation here on a monthly basis. We're just looking at the cash in, cash out, essentially per cycle, to keep things simple and in perspective for people that aren't overly familiar with non-cash expenses. So let's just dive into it here, starting with our expenses. Since we operate as a contract grower, you'll notice here the only expenses included are our core operating expenses. This is because as a contract grower, you're only responsible for growing the chickens. You don't have downstream sales and logistics costs. You're not paying for the trucks to come pick them up. So the actual operations end up being fairly simple. Like the business model is quite simple, and that reveals itself here in the income statement as well. So we have utilities, $50,000. That varies a little bit month by month, but generally an average around there. Wi-Fi, $2,500. Payroll, $25,000. Gas, $70,000. So I spoke before, we're spending a lot on gas, these gas leaks as well, and then you see $70,000 here, which isn't materially less than it was previous cycles. So this cycle, it was actually so cold throughout the cycle. I thought we were getting into the summer. You can hear my dog barking maybe, but I thought it was getting into the summer, but then the nighttime temperatures ended up being quite cold on Philippine standard and for the chickens. So we ended up using heat quite a bit, and then we ordered a little bit of excess gas. If you've seen, this would have been like week 3 maybe. I ended up running out of gas, and everybody's like, you gotta have gas, like terrible preparation. And I agree, but what's going through my mind at the time, since we're not selling these chickens downstream, our income is based on the fee we get paid for our performance and then the expenses we incur operating the farm. So my thought process is thinking, gas is really expensive right now. Will it meaningfully improve my performance if I purchase additional gas canisters, or will the cost of those additional gas canisters outweigh the benefit I get from an increased performance, if that makes sense? So I'm looking at potentially the performance goes a little bit worse if I don't get gas, but then I save on the cost of getting more gas. So potentially it nets out to actually be better that way. Or I get gas and then maybe our performance goes even higher, and then that incremental financial increase is higher than what the gas cost, if you kind of see what I'm saying. So that was kind of my thought process there, where I wasn't immediately eager to get gas because I was weighing the pros and cons of how much the gas costs versus what performance benefit is that really gonna give me. If I was running a commercial farm, of course I'd have gas on hand, but that's not really the model here. So just kind of strategically thinking financially what's gonna be best for me, to be honest. And maybe a slight reduction in performance, but a huge save on the cost there would actually end up netting me more money. And that's where my brain was going there. As we keep going down the list, we have rice hull for $5,500, chick paper, disinfectants, water filters, harvesting labor. It's not the core team at the farm that does the harvesting. We bring in like 10 other people that come harvest the chickens. And then we have cleaning labor and supplies. Again, it's not, sometimes it's the people at the farm, but sometimes we get other people to come in and clean the farm as well. Some repairs and maintenance. Top of my head, I'm trying to think what broke, but probably a fan motor probably broke. Probably the feeding auger motor probably broke, if I had to guess. I can't remember exactly, but that's what I had down for repairs and maintenance. And then in other, just a buffer for miscellaneous expenses. We buy food for people and whatever else. Maybe we bought some light bulbs or something. So that brings our total operating expenses to 204,500 pesos here. So now we have our expenses. We'll move back up to the top line, our revenue, our top line sales figure. What are our earnings before expenses here? In the contract grower game, this is typically represented by a per bird fee that you get. You get your, your performance statement from the integrator, and it'll all round down to a per bird figure. Last cycle's was quite good, and then this cycle was obviously a little bit worse because our performance, so it arrived at around 30 pesos per bird, which ends up coming out to 421,700 pesos as that top line revenue figure. So when you have a poor harvest recovery and then poor SCR, it's like a bit of a double whammy. You have a lower per bird fee, and then you have less chicks. So it's like that fee applies to less chickens too, versus if you get a higher performance, you have a higher per bird fee and more birds that applies to, and then it's, almost enhances the revenue there, so to speak. But anyways, you take our revenue, you subtract our expenses, and that gives us an earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization, your EBITDA for any accountants out there or financial people, and we arrive at 217,200 pesos as our net operating earnings for cycle number 3. Geez, I don't know if you can hear that. These dogs are going brazy out here. We're in the province, baby. We're out here in the Philippines province, and you can hear it out there. For those, just a little side tangent. People like, if you're in a barangay here in the province, like everybody has a dog outside, and you walk by and they just go crazy. Like I go to walk my dogs, and you wake up the whole neighborhood. You wake up the next 3 neighborhoods, and that's what you're hearing right there. Is probably somebody walking by with their dog, and everybody else's dog is freaking out. So there it is, folks. Cycle number 3 here. And you probably see if it's your first time, you're thinking, damn, that's a lot of work just to make, what is that, USD, $3,500 US almost. And that is absolutely true. But this is square one here. We have a lot of exciting stuff coming in the future. We have the new construction of the 25,000 capacity farm is really nearing completion. This has gone probably twice as long as I initially expected. So there's been a lot of frustration in the process here, but it is making its way. The equipment is now installed, so we'll end up doing a full tour of what the facility looks like and when that gets up and running. So that is exciting. And then some relative plans, we'll end up trying to build out more of a compound, so to speak, and add additional buildings, and then potentially become more of a commercial producer in the space. Time will tell. And we're starting to try to plan a few trips to other countries and see farms out in those countries, how people do things. What is the management process of a farm in wherever, Africa or another country in Southeast Asia. So I have a trip planned going to Indonesia where we'll see 6-figure capacity layer farm, broiler farms, sales process, how they get processed. So it should be quite interesting. I'm quite interested to see how it's done and how people do things in other countries. Should be a great learning experience for me, hopefully a learning experience for you, and should just be interesting to see the insides of more opaque industry that you don't really get a clear view into, especially in different countries that you may not live in. So if you made it to this long in the video, you've heard me ramble for this long, like and subscribe. We're starting to build up a meaningful channel here. We have a bit of a community going here, which is nice to see. I never thought in my life I'd have a YouTube channel and have subscribers growing on it, to be honest. It's pretty, like when I actually think about it, it's pretty crazy. So feel free to subscribe, leave a comment or whatever else. There's lots of exciting stuff to come. Thank you all for the support thus far. It's been a pretty interesting journey for me in the Philippines. I've learned a lot. It feels like when I look back to the first cycle, it's like, Jesus, I can't even believe I made it out of that one. So it's, you learn so much so quick. When you look back even a month before, it's like, how was I even functioning at all? So, onwards and upwards here. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.